Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Knight d2 to f3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to f4. Knight b6 to c4. Queen d1 to c1. Pawn b7 to b5. Pawn a2 to a4. Knight c6 to b4. Bishop d3 to b1. Pawn a7 to a6. Pawn b2 to b3. Knight c4 to b6. Pawn a4 takes b5. Pawn a6 takes b5. Rook a1 takes a8. Knight b6 takes a8. Knight f3 to g5. Knight b4 to a2. Bishop b1 takes a2. Knight a8 to b6. Bishop a2 to b1. Bishop e7 takes g5. Bishop f4 takes g5. Queen d8 to e8. Queen c1 to c5. Knight b6 to a8. Bishop g5 to e7. Knight a8 to b6. Bishop e7 takes f8. Knight b6 to d7. Bishop b1 takes h7, check. King g8 takes h7. Queen c5 to c2, check. King h7 to g8. Rook f1 to c1. Knight d7 takes f8. Queen c2 to c6. Bishop c8 to d7. Queen c6 to d6. Knight f8 to g6. Rook c1 to c7. Bishop d7 to c8. Pawn b3 to b4. Queen e8 to f8. Queen d6 takes f8, check. Knight g6 takes f8. Rook c7 takes c8. Pawn g7 to g5. Knight e2 to c3. King g8 to g7. Rook c8 to c7. Knight f8 to g6. Pawn f2 to f3. Knight g6 to f4. King g1 to f2. Knight f4 to d3, check. King f2 to e3. Knight d3 to f4. Pawn g2 to g3. Knight f4 to g2, check. King e3 to f2. Pawn g5 to g4. Pawn f3 takes g4. Knight g2 to e1. King f2 takes e1. King g7 to g6. Knight c3 takes b5. King g6 to g7. Rook c7 to c8. King g7 to g6. Pawn h2 to h4. King g6 to g7. King e1 to d2. Pawn f7 to f5. Knight b5 to d6. Pawn f5 takes g4. King d2 to c3. King g7 to g6. Rook c8 to c7. King g6 to h5. Pawn b4 to b5. King h5 to g6. Rook c7 to e7. King g6 to h5. Pawn b5 to b6. King h5 to g6. Pawn b6 to b7. King g6 to h5. King c3 to d3. King h5 to g6. King d3 to c3. King g6 to h5. King c3 to d3. King h5 to g6. Rook e7 takes e6, check. King g6 to g7. Rook e6 to e7, check. King g7 to g6. King d3 to c3. King g6 to h5. Rook e7 to g7. King h5 to h6. Rook g7 to g5. King h6 to h7. Pawn e5 to e6. King h7 to h6. Pawn e6 to e7. King h6 to h7. Pawn h4 to h5. King h7 to h6. Knight d6 to f7, check. King h6 to h7. Knight f7 to d6. King h7 to h6. Knight d6 to f7, check. King h6 to h7. Knight f7 to d8. King h7 to h6. Knight d8 to e6. King h6 to h7. Knight e6 to f4. King h7 to h6. Rook g5 takes g4. King h6 to h7. Rook g4 to g6. King h7 to h8. Pawn g3 to g4. King h8 to h7. Pawn g4 to g5. King h7 to h8. Pawn h5 to h6. King h8 to h7. Rook g6 to g7, check. King h7 to h8. Knight f4 to g6, checkmate.